Ryan Bennett's alarm clock buzzed in his ear, piercing the stillness of his small apartment. He groaned, blindly reaching for his phone to silence it. His fingers fumbled on the nightstand for a few moments, swiping at nothing but air until he finally found the screen and shut it off. There was no more snooze button, no more delaying the inevitable. He sat up in bed, squinting against the morning light that streamed through the window. For a brief, blissful moment, he felt the warmth of the blankets cocooning him. And then the reality hit. He was late for work. Ryan swore under his breath and scrambled out of bed, trying not to trip on the mess of clothes strewn across the floor. He had been putting off doing laundry for weeks now. It was a habit he'd picked up in his new life as an IT technician. In the grand scheme of things, cleaning his apartment didn't seem nearly as pressing as figuring out the latest software bug or debugging an issue with the company's servers. The morning felt like it always did. His apartment, though small, was home. The clutter, the half-empty coffee mugs, the digital clocks blinking wildly on every surface, everything was exactly as it should be. Nothing had changed. Until it did. Ryan paused in front of his bathroom mirror, brushing his teeth. The routine was something automatic, something he barely had to think about anymore. But this time, something was different. As he glanced up at his reflection, his hand stopped mid-brush. It wasn't him. The man staring back at him had a clean-cut jawline, slick black hair neatly combed to one side, and piercing blue eyes. Ryan blinked several times, wondering if he'd misjudged the lighting or if his exhaustion from lack of sleep was playing tricks on him. But no, the man in the mirror was definitely not him. He didn't know this face. This wasn't Ryan Bennett's reflection. Panic bubbled in his chest. His breath quickened as he took a step back. He reached out, fingers trembling as he touched the cool surface of the mirror. The man in the reflection followed suit, his movements synchronizing exactly with Ryan's. Ryan shook his head. No. This wasn't happening. He took a deep breath, telling himself that there was a rational explanation. Maybe he was just half asleep, maybe he'd been dreaming. But as he blinked again, the man in the mirror, still a stranger, grinned. Ryan recoiled, nearly dropping his toothbrush. What the hell? He felt his heart thudding against his chest. He rushed to check his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. There was an email from a colleague, David, asking him about a project at work. Ryan barely registered it. He opened the camera app and held the phone up to his face. The reflection staring back at him in the phone's camera was also wrong. His nose was different, his eyes were a shade of greenish blue he didn't remember. He had to get out of there. Ryan's mind raced, spinning in circles as he tried to make sense of it all. He stumbled out of the bathroom and into his living room, glancing at the clock on the wall. 9:42 a.m. What happened to me? He was breathing heavily now, not from exertion but from pure shock. His apartment, his clothes, his things, they were all still there. But his body, his identity, his self, it wasn't. He sat down on the couch and pulled his legs to his chest, trying to gather his thoughts. Nothing made sense. Nothing at all. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again, this time with a video call from a woman named Olivia. He didn't recognize the name, but something about it felt strangely familiar. Hesitant, he accepted the call, bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. The woman's face popped up on the screen. She smiled warmly, her eyes shining with affection. Ryan opened his mouth, but when he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. It was rich, deep, and confident. The words that came out were clear and practiced. "Hey, Olivia, how are you?" Her smile didn't waver. "I'm good, Ollie. I was just calling to remind you about dinner tonight. Mom wants us all to meet at her place. You in?" Ryan's head swam. Ollie? Who the hell was Ollie? And why was this woman calling him like they were family? Sure, he stammered. His voice sounded too sure of itself. Too smooth. Not his at all. "You sound different today," Olivia said, furrowing her brow slightly. "Did you sleep well?" Ryan's heart raced again. Sleep well? He hadn't slept at all. He didn't even recognize the person staring back at him in the mirror, let alone anyone who might be his family. "I'm fine," he said, forcing himself to smile. He didn't know how to explain it, but something told him that if he didn't play along, if he didn't pretend to be this Ollie, things might spiral out of control even faster. "Dinner sounds great. I'll be there." Olivia beamed. "I'll see you tonight then." "Love you, Ollie." She blew him a kiss and ended the call. Ryan sat there, staring at the screen for a moment, still trying to process the conversation. "Love you, Ollie." He repeated the words to himself. It felt foreign. And yet, as he said them, they felt oddly real. Was it possible that this was who he was now? Who he had been? But he didn't recognize himself. And the more he thought about it, the more alien his own body seemed. There was only one way to find out. Ryan stood up and went to his closet. His hand hovered over the clothes, picking out a suit he didn't remember owning. It fit perfectly, too perfectly. He looked at himself in the mirror one more time, touching his cheek. The man staring back at him seemed so real. But so wrong. The day dragged on in a haze. Ryan forced himself to go through the motions, trying to act like Oliver Montgomery, the high-powered lawyer he had become, or was it always who he was? He couldn't remember. He couldn't remember anything clearly, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. By the time he left for dinner, the confusion had only deepened. He couldn't escape the feeling that his life was slipping away, that he was no longer in control. Was he still Ryan Bennett? Or had he become this other person entirely? At dinner, the Montgomery family was warm and welcoming, treating him like he was part of the fold. The conversation flowed effortlessly. But all the while, Ryan, no, Oliver, felt out of place. He tried to smile, nod, and laugh at the appropriate moments, but every movement felt like an act. Every word was foreign. When he finally excused himself to use the bathroom, he locked the door behind him, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man who looked back at him was confident, collected, nothing like Ryan had ever been. But who the hell was Ryan anymore? Ryan stared at the man in the mirror, his reflection somehow more alien with each passing second. His eyes weren't his eyes. His jaw wasn't his jaw. His posture, straight, confident, and poised, was someone else entirely. For the briefest moment, he wished it was just some elaborate joke, some weird dream he was bound to wake up from, but deep down, he knew this wasn't a dream. This was real, and no matter how many times he blinked, the stranger staring back at him remained. There was no escaping the man he'd become. As he stood in the bathroom, the silence felt suffocating, oppressive. The sound of his own breath, shallow and uneven, echoed in the small room. Who am I? The question hung in the air, unanswered. As he wiped his hands on his suit jacket, the knock on the bathroom door broke him out of his trance. "Hey, Ollie, everything okay in there?" Olivia's voice carried through the wood. It sounded casual, normal, like nothing had changed. Like she knew him, this new version of him, as well as she knew herself. "Yeah, just a second," he called back, forcing a tone of calm he didn't feel. He took one last look at the man in the mirror, smoothing the lapels of the suit, and then turned the handle, stepping back into the dining room. The Montgomerys, Olivia, her husband, a couple of younger cousins, were seated around the table, chatting about the usual things. Business, weather, a recent family trip to the coast. Nothing felt out of place except for Ryan, or Ollie, as they were calling him, sitting at the head of the table, like he belonged. He moved automatically. He smiled at the appropriate moments, sipped the wine when everyone else did, and nodded in agreement when someone mentioned a recent merger. But inside, he was still processing what had happened, trying to piece together who he was. Or maybe, more accurately, who he wasn't anymore. At dinner, conversation meandered from the weather to new movies, and then to the latest tech news. Ryan found himself making comments on software updates, tech company mergers, things he never would have thought about as himself. He could hear his voice, smooth and polished, flowing through the words like he'd done it 1,000 times before. But each time he opened his mouth, he wasn't sure who was speaking, Ryan Bennett, the tech nerd, or Oliver Montgomery, the lawyer. "So, Ollie," Olivia said, breaking his train of thought, "how's the new project going? I heard you're working on something big with Elysium." Elysium. The name sent a flicker of recognition through his mind, like a spark in the dark. It was the company that had offered him the weird project. The reason he'd even agreed to it, this body swap experiment in the first place. But he couldn't remember much about it. The details were fuzzy, buried under layers of new memories and identities. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, it's going well. They've got some cutting-edge stuff going on. Definitely exciting." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "You sound a little more excited than usual. Is everything okay?" Ryan, Oliver, tensed up. His hand, still holding the wine glass, shook slightly. "Is everything okay?" That was the question, wasn't it? "Was anything okay?" "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. It felt like a mask, like it didn't quite fit, but it had to. He couldn't afford to slip up. "Well, I think you'll be glad to know that Mom's been asking about you," Olivia said, leaning back in her chair. "She wants to know when you're going to finally settle down. You know how she gets." Ryan stared at her, wondering what she meant by that. Settle down? Was this something Oliver had been struggling with? Was he the kind of person who couldn't settle down? It didn't seem to fit the man in the suit who spoke with such authority, who walked with his head held high like he owned the room. He felt like a fraud, sitting there in this perfect life that wasn't his. "I'll figure it out," he muttered, hoping the words didn't sound as uncertain as they felt. He glanced around the table at the Montgomery family, happy, normal, whole. He had none of that, did he? Not anymore. Not since Elysium's experiment had ripped away the only identity he'd ever known and replaced it with a collection of pieces he couldn't even comprehend. After dinner, the conversation turned toward old family stories, things Ryan couldn't even pretend to remember. He smiled and nodded, but the laughter that followed felt like it belonged to someone else. This wasn't his family. This wasn't his life. "I'm gonna head out early," he said, standing up abruptly. The weight of the night, the pressure of pretending, was too much. "I have work in the morning. Thanks for dinner." Olivia shot him a puzzled look but didn't argue. "All right, Ollie. See you soon." Ryan walked out of the house, his steps mechanical, each footfall like a drumbeat that kept time with the confusion swirling in his mind. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be Oliver Montgomery. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he made his way down the sidewalk. It was a text from David, his actual colleague, asking about a project update. Ryan couldn't bring himself to answer. Who was he anymore? He didn't even recognize himself when he looked in the mirror, let alone the life he was supposed to return to. Elysium's project, it had promised something more, something new. But this? This wasn't the life he'd signed up for. This was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As he reached his apartment, Ryan's mind reeled. He needed to find out what was happening, what had gone wrong. He needed to know if this was temporary, if he'd wake up tomorrow as himself again, back in his own skin, back in the life he'd built. But as he turned the key and stepped inside, something inside him knew this was no temporary glitch. This wasn't a dream, this was his new reality, and that realization hit him with a cold, sickening finality. The apartment seemed even quieter than usual. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, everything was muted, as though it too was holding its breath. Ryan walked to the bathroom again, just to see. Just to confirm. But when he looked in the mirror, there he was again, Oliver Montgomery. This time, though, the face staring back at him seemed different. It wasn't just unfamiliar, it seemed like it was fading into something even stranger, something more distant. He reached for the edge of the sink, his fingers brushing against the cool surface, but he couldn't look away from his own face. It was as if his mind was fighting to reconcile the fact that the face in the mirror was now his, was always his. The body he inhabited didn't belong to Ryan Bennett anymore. And maybe, just maybe, it never had. Ryan, or Ollie, felt something in the back of his mind snap. Something told him that the longer he stayed in this state, the more it would consume him. How much of him had already been lost? How much of the person he was remained? He ran a hand over his face, trying to ground himself. "This is insane," he muttered to no one in particular. Then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed again. Another text. This time, it was from Elysium Technologies. The message read, "Your next body swap is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Prepare for transition." Ryan's blood ran cold. It was happening again. But this time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The text from Elysium Technologies sat on his phone screen like a bomb waiting to go off. "Your next body swap is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Prepare for transition." Ryan, or Ollie, stared at it, his mind working overtime to catch up. The message was clear, but it made no sense. Was he really going to do this again? Was he about to lose control of his identity once more and become someone else entirely? The idea of leaving the man he had become, the polished lawyer with the sleek hair, the confident voice, was almost comforting. But in a twisted way, it felt like he was being pulled deeper into a web, a labyrinth where the walls were closing in with every passing moment. He felt both trapped and oddly relieved. At least, when he swapped, he could stop pretending. He stood in the middle of his apartment, gripping the phone with fingers that felt stiff and foreign. How long would this last? Was he going to keep hopping from one life to the next until he lost track of who he was completely? Or would the program end, and he would wake up as himself again, a simple tech nerd stuck in a world that didn't seem to want him anymore? Ryan paced the apartment, his shoes clicking against the hardwood floors, the sound sharp in the silence. He wasn't sure why he'd agreed to this project in the first place. The money, sure. The promise of something more, something beyond his usual mundane existence, definitely. But now it felt like a cruel joke. He could feel the pull of Elysium's promise, the allure of becoming something more than just Ryan Bennett. Each body swap had been an opportunity to live someone else's life, to see the world through someone else's eyes. But as he lost himself in each new persona, he began to wonder if it was worth it. The night stretched on, and Ryan, Ollie, watched the minutes tick away on the clock. He should have gone to bed, should have rested. But how could he sleep when he didn't know who he was anymore? His body, Oliver's body, seemed to move without his consent, his mind whirring as he tried to make sense of what had happened. Each swap had taken something from him, slowly eroding the person he used to be. He thought about calling Olivia, about asking her what she saw in him, what she thought he was. But every time he started to type out a message, something inside him froze. What if I'm not Ollie anymore? What if I'm just lost? He turned the phone over in his hand, half expecting to see another message, but it was silent. The stillness in the apartment was suffocating. He needed answers. The next morning came too soon. As the clock on the wall read 7:30 a.m., Ryan received a notification from Elysium, transition in 30 minutes. Prepare for the next subject body. His heart raced. There was no turning back now. He stood in front of the mirror again, looking at the face that wasn't his, at the body he had learned to wear like a second skin. His reflection seemed to mock him, showing him someone he didn't know but who knew how to smile, to talk, to act as though everything was just fine. But it wasn't fine. Not at all. The transition was supposed to be simple, just a brief blackout as his consciousness was transferred to the next body. But as Ryan closed his eyes and braced himself, a wave of nausea hit him, sharp and sudden, as though the very act of shifting had begun to unravel him from the inside out. He blinked, opening his eyes again, and when his gaze fell on the mirror, the world seemed to shift beneath him. He was no longer in the apartment, no longer standing in front of a familiar bathroom. His surroundings were entirely different. The walls were a warm beige, the furniture sleek and modern. A large painting hung on the wall, a minimalist piece of abstract art. The room smelled faintly of incense. Ryan took a step forward, his feet feeling heavy, uncertain. The body he now inhabited was taller, more athletic. His arms were muscular, his posture broader. He flexed his fingers, amazed by the strength that pulsed through them, and as he moved, he could feel the power in his legs, the energy in his frame. This wasn't Oliver. This wasn't him. He walked into the adjoining room, a spacious kitchen with polished granite counters, and spotted the calendar on the wall. The name on it was different. Not Ryan Bennett. Not even Oliver Montgomery. Mia Lancaster. Mia Lancaster? Who the hell was Mia Lancaster? The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. His eyes flickered over the kitchen, scanning the shelves, the appliances, the perfectly organized fruit bowl. There was a family photo on the counter, and his reflection, her reflection, stared back at him from the image, a woman smiling at a camera with 2 children at her side. This wasn't a simple body swap. This wasn't a neat, clinical process that removed him from one life and placed him into another. It felt wrong, more like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, an incomplete story that was slowly revealing itself piece by piece. But Ryan, no, Mia Lancaster, didn't have time to question it. A voice from the other room snapped him out of his thoughts. Mia, are you up? You've got a busy day ahead. The voice was warm, maternal, kind. It belonged to a man, probably her husband. Ryan froze, feeling a strange twist of something deep inside him. Was he really ready for this? Was he ready to dive into another identity, another life, another layer of this endless illusion? Coming, honey, he called out, hearing Mia's voice echo in his throat. The sound of it was foreign, yet it came out so easily, so naturally. As though he had been living in this skin for years. He moved toward the sound of the voice, walking through the house with no sense of how he had arrived here or what the hell was going on. The man sitting at the kitchen table had salt and pepper hair, glasses perched low on his nose, and a cup of coffee in hand. He smiled as she, Mia, entered, but his eyes weren't exactly warm. There was something strained there, something that made Ryan pause. Mia Lancaster's life seemed perfect on the surface, but there were cracks just beneath. Morning, Mia. How's the wildlife center going? The man asked, his voice casual, like he was used to asking this question every morning. Ryan paused, unsure of what to say. Wildlife center? Mia ran a wildlife center? Oh, it's good, Ryan heard himself say, the words coming out of his mouth like they belonged to someone else. Busy, but I'm handling it. The man nodded, giving her a brief smile, before glancing at his watch. All right, well, I'll be back in the evening. Don't forget about the charity dinner tonight. I'll need your support on that. Ryan nodded, pretending he knew exactly what he was supposed to do. Of course. I'll see you then. Mia, or Ryan, watched as the man left the room, the front door closing behind him with a soft click. The moment of silence that followed felt suffocating. What was going on? He had never run a wildlife center. He had no idea who this man was, or why he was supposed to be Mia Lancaster now. The weight of his situation pressed down on him, the confusion making it hard to breathe. How many identities had he worn? How many lives had he borrowed, only to forget them when the transition ended? Ryan, or Mia, stood in the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling of wrongness, the sense of being other in a world that was supposed to be his. But the longer he stayed in this new body, the harder it became to tell where Mia's life ended and his began. A chime sounded from the counter, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. Mia's phone. He glanced at it, half expecting it to be another message from Elysium. But this time, the name on the screen was familiar: Olivia Montgomery. Olivia. Was she still his sister? Or was Mia Lancaster's sister and now calling her? He reached for the phone, heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, Mia," Olivia's voice crackled through the phone, and Ryan froze. "How's everything going? I haven't heard from you in a while." Ryan opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Everything's fine," he said, but it was Mia's voice, not his. "Good. I'll stop by later today. Don't forget about the dinner tonight. I know you've got your hands full with the center, but we can't have you miss it." Ryan felt his stomach churn as the last threads of his identity unraveled. The dinner. The charity event. The man who called himself her husband. None of it was familiar. But it was all real. And Ryan Bennett was losing himself, one body at a time.